They said, what was perestroika like? And the guy went and he took the painting off the wall, turned it upside down and put it back on. And I'm like, right. And so right now, my practice for this world is I look at every value in our dominant culture. I figure out the exact opposite and I put it into practice.
Thursday, October 29, 2020, just a few days before the presidential election. To the curious, the seekers, and the experts, welcome. You're listening to Poli-Psych Podcast. With the election looming so near, we decided to give some time today to considering some of the forces that are impacting upon the election and that may impact upon the election. With me today are Don and Ken. Would you both like to introduce yourselves and give your Enneagram and MBTI types?
Sure, Cindy. Glad to be here. And I am MBTI INTJ and Enneagram 5, pretty much equal wing and social subtype.
And I am Ken. I survey as INTJ, Enneagram 9. I think it's a 1. But anyway, Cindy, you forgot to note the time, 2:34 p.m. or 14:34.
Yes,
and the reason
anything can happen, right?
Anything, and it probably will. So
this is right before that big explosion that happened. So we're getting to you right before that.
I don't know. Yeah, it's going to come from somewhere. It's every day is like it's about a month. You know, could use a vacation, but that's how it is. We've been preparing for this moment for a long time, and it's upon us. And here we are, Thursday, and a week from now, we'll be counting the votes for another month. Just kidding. The one thing about this, and we'll be getting into this in the show, is the opposition, as we call it. We are Trump supporters, full disclosure, and the opposition is really cleverly eroding our conceptual understanding of what an election is. So, in regards to that, is they're stretching out the time limit. Normally, it's election night, and normally you have resolution of that issue by the usually the wee hours of the morning, and here they're trying to make it stretch interminably into the future using the pretext of mail-in voting, which is anchored off the pretext of the COVID what I consider an overreaction. I think maybe that opinion is shared here, but President Trump is reacting in an interesting way, and the rallies are moving forward, sometimes up to 5 a day. I think there were 5 on Sunday. But the difference is he's focusing on swing states. We won't have, I live in New York State, we won't have a Trump rally as far as I can tell. So the states that would be most fertile ground for election, mail-in voting fraud, essentially, possibly, would be the blue states, where the state controls the tabulation process, and the blue states, the implication there is that they would be more susceptible to, tipping the vote in their favor. Don, what are your thoughts moving into the momentous week ahead?
Yeah, Ken, I just want to add to your description of us as Trump supporters. This is true, but we are not traditionally blanket endorsement of Republicans. So we all kind of came to this position in our own different ways, which we won't go into detail now, but we basically do believe that there's an awakening going on, and that Trump is a representative of the American people from the outside of the establishment. And that's what's creating all of the controversy, because he's outside of the media establishment as well as the political establishment. So that's sort of the groundwork, the lay of the land here as we look at the current situation. I'm looking at this election event as being like 2016 on steroids. If you remember, going into 2016, everybody in the mainstream media was saying Hillary was 98% certain to win, something along those lines, above 90%. And then we learned otherwise, as Trump basically had an easy electoral college victory. I think we're basically going for a repeat of that same electoral distribution, meaning that Trump will. He does have the votes. I believe the internal polling and just his confidence in the rallies and his celebrating there, dancing on stage, I believe he knows he's going to win. And the stronger the landslide is, if you wanted to use that term, then the more difficult it will be for the opposing forces, especially in the media, to prolong that election event into days or weeks and try to bring in ballots that they found here and there lying by the road or whatever. So the overwhelming support for President Trump, I believe, is going to be evident, and the most interesting thing will be to see how the media handles that. And Congress is already somewhat acquiescing in some ways, and we're talking before the show a little bit about Dianne Feinstein and people like that, and we're seeing actually some real extreme weakness in China, and as we know, politically and monetarily, that's been a lot of the force against President Trump has been coming out of China, not just the virus, but lots of media that has been backed as being pro-Biden, anti-Trump, also has a China connection. So we're looking at that as being basically, I think, a domino that's about ready to fall. And I've even seen evidences that there is going to be something like a coup is going on in China right now as their financial base continues to crumble. So exciting times we're living in, and didn't mean to go on that long, but there's a lot going on.
Yeah, no, we started this series. This is the third part of a three-part show that we started. Actually, you, Don, and Cindy started this theme, and we were talking at that point, focusing on the critical race theory. And the reason for that was not as much to dissect the critical race theory as to look at the Marxist dialectic and how beliefs and policy can be altered, how to alter the sociological frame that in which a culture can be directed. And interestingly enough, the focus has moved into slightly different areas. And the reason critical race theory was so important is because it did anchor the protest movement. And what we'll be focusing in on today is the actual mobilization post-election day. And this all of a sudden is turning from a race issue into an actual war, an actual conflict scenario. And it'll be a pretty easy jump, because basically what we had going on here is we had the pretext and the psychological glue to kind of unite a mass of people to be directed to actually taking to the streets and actually shutting down the city of Washington, D.C., which we'll be exploring. And we need to look at it. We'll be exploring it more from a psychological perspective. But we were very impressed with a show that just came out yesterday. It was a webinar that was produced by the Center for Security Policy. And Washington, D.C., the Beltway, as they call it, is loaded with companies, consultants that specialize in various areas and are basically advisors to a lot of the government functionaries, and work as a sort of, a brain trust there. And there's a lot going on in that community. And we are especially drawn to that community because they do utilize a lot of the psychological principles and analysis that we're using today. And what they pointed to is sort of and we'll post the article, and hopefully people can listen to that separately. It's about a 1-hour webinar on post-election insurrection. And this didn't just come out of nowhere. It starts with something Cindy will put on the screen, and we're I was not as familiar with it, although we see the themes, the dominant themes are run right through this document. It was originally published earlier in the year, and by the Transition Integrity Project, or TIP as they refer to it. And you can kind of see these themes running through right down to the other end of the spectrum, which is the street level trainers who were just becoming acquainted with online. And this is the organization is known as Shutdown DC, and they've sort of become this umbrella pop-up organization. But I was looking at this really for the first time today. Cindy probably is in the same boat I am, but Cindy, as you thumb through that set of points, it was actually a document, I think. But if you describe what you're seeing there in your own words, if you would, what were your first impressions with that, if it is the first time? Yeah.
Yes, yeah. I remember seeing a video on this topic shortly after this paper was produced, and if memory serves, Nancy Pelosi was quite involved. And I think the video that I saw may have been about the public announcement that Nancy Pelosi made. She was very heavily involved with this, and my impression is, what is stated, I mean, they're calling this a peaceful transition, preventing a disrupted presidential election and transition. That's the title of this paper. When in reality, what I believe they actually want to do is inspire doubt in people's minds as to the validity of a Trump win. And they're operating under the assumption that, the stated assumption that the president will refuse to leave the White House. And the plans and the role playing that they did were to organize a response, or I guess I call it a reaction to the president not being willing to leave the White House. And again, the assumption is that the people will want him to leave the White House. And the biggest problem that I have with all of these ideas and these organizations, that some of whom we will mention today, is that they operate under the general assumption that their will should be able to trump, if you'll forgive the pun, the expressed will of the voters. And anybody who has watched President Trump's rallies, I think, is probably aware that there is a groundswell of grassroots support for the president. And these organizations and institutions in this group, they're trying to deny that. They're trying to deny the express will of the people. And they don't consider that, gee, maybe this is what the people want. They only consider, how do we make the president leave?
Well, that's what transition integrity is all about, right? You're questioning the integrity of the person in the White House, and you've got to get rid of them. And so if you want the integrity of the deep state to continue, you've got to get rid of this guy, because he's given them a real hard time. And we know that the deep state is the entity that really is the bastion of integrity for the American system. Am I right?
It just in the name itself is, and this, we'll get into linguistics later too, is transition. The first word in the phrase assumes that there will be a transition. So they kind of build that in there to frame the whole argument from there. And it looks like it is a deep state gathering. I mean, just the way it's described in the header is people that were put out of work during the Obama, who were in the Obama administration, were expecting to have a continuum going into the Hillary Clinton administration, and were suddenly left in a lurch. So that's why I believe the reaction was not as well thought through in 2016 because it was a novelty. And I think that kind of burned them in a way. And this time they weren't going to miss the opportunity to kind of organize in advance. What they didn't see was the advent of the Biden laptop controversy, and also the fact that appears to be the case that this is just the tip of the iceberg.
Yeah, I have to point out that name is just, to me, it's right up there with Patriot Act. It's like the opposite of what it claims to be. And they want transition integrity by pretending to be the ones that are really wanting continuity of the American system, when actually they're the ones that are attempting to carry out very subversive things.
So up pops into our consciousness the Shutdown DC organization, which, very similar to Black Lives Matter, was almost completely dormant or non-existent. I haven't looked into the precursor, but it first came up in the news with the Rand Paul attack during, I think it was what was the event, Don? Well, whatever it was about 2 months ago. President Trump did a speech near the White House, and then I think it was the convention. I think it was the last night of the convention. And then Shutdown DC had engineered a pretty serious set of disruptions right after that concluded. And so here they are. They have a very well-constructed website and obviously well-funded in other ways. It's basically an army of people. It also includes a bicycle corps, which drills regularly, and that will probably be one of the surprises that we'll see on the 4th of November. The reason that's being brought up is that's anchoring another one of the pretexts for this whole thing. I mean, the pretexts are very similar. If you go from the Transition Integrity Project right through to the trainers who are actually putting together the strategic and tactical arrangements for how to disrupt the city, which appears to have been left. This name was not familiar to me at all until maybe a couple weeks ago or so. Her name is Lisa Fithian, and she pops up on the website also, and has been apparently conducting training sessions, and that's also on that same Shutdown DC calendar. And the pretext is spelled out. It has the same talking points as the Transition Integrity Project. So it's almost like it's an end-to-end silent collusion with the actual insurrection, that they actually literally call it an insurrection, and they'll be executing that through a schedule that they've also published right on this website. Now, whether that's meant to terrorize the public, or it's meant to be an internal communication, or both, it's coming. It's definitely happening. And the only thing that would stop it would be blockades or something of that nature. So it may actually be a provocation trying to get popular support, basically by setting up human shields, by bringing in bystanders and protest participants who eventually get roped into mob activity. We saw that happen in the Rochester restaurant invasion, where you had people that were probably just sort of, protest tourists coming downtown to gather the experience, and then getting swept away by the lure of the crowd. And this is a very predictable thing that they've pulled in Europe, the Maidan, and a lot of these skills were picked up by the Obama administration's operatives who were working in Europe. And again, they're now unemployed, probably gainfully employed now, working on these same techniques for the United States version of the color revolution.
Yeah, Ken, you mentioned Lisa Fithian, and I wanted to give some people some context and what and how to think about her and this movement, that she's at least one of the leaders that, about shutting down DC. She's written a book called Shut It Down Now. So very much in the left-wing activist area. And this webinar that we were able to view, that was put on by some professionals associated with the Department of Homeland Security, characterized her in the following way. Now, this webinar is up on YouTube, and it's called Post-Election Insurrection, the Civil Unrest in the Coming Months, and it was coordinated by Kyle Shideler, also with Michael Anton and Michael Waller. And the way that they characterized Lisa Fithian and others that are associated with her, she's definitely not the only one, but as basically the Angela Davis types from the 60s and 70s that were having a last go at it, that they've had this dream of flipping the United States to be a communist government, getting rid of the Constitution, and this is their last chance. You know, she's got gray hair, they're older, but they still have this same dream, and that's how these professionals characterized her, and I think that's pretty accurate. I remember back to my college days, and there was those elements that were there trying to get broad popular support. I never understood it, never understood how that was possible in America, but when you see the steps that they've taken, actually over decades behind the scenes, and I won't get into detail here, but it's very, very real. And it's come to the point where it's now surfacing, and it's not something that can be ignored as, oh, these are just a bunch of tree huggers, or, you know, a bunch of people that are, you know, have their head in the clouds. No, these are people that are activists at the grassroots level and purposely disrupting things in a very serious way.
And their motive, interestingly, is, as Kyle expressed, and as it's starting to appear in print, is fight for the enemy you want to have, or something to that effect. And thinking that through, it means that they're trying to knock out the more powerful adversary and then control the weaker later. So they're fighting for Joe Biden with the hope of controlling Joe Biden. That's sort of the subtext. Now, whether they mean that or whether they intend to do that could be true, but it also could be another dialectical argument where they come in with the extreme and then settle for something in between the two extremes. And that's kind of the progressively how you erode an adversary also is by a series of concessions to a binary proposition. Most laws are binary propositions. Either you violated the law or you didn't. And the way to get around that is by reducing those laws to gray areas. So here we have an organization openly promoting insurrection, openly saying they're going to haul duly elected President Trump from office, and with a cadre of followers that have been conditioned by the following pretexts, and they mostly revolve around the same talking points we've heard for months and years, really, as the Trump is a racist narrative, the disliking Trump, which is really sort of unrelated, but it's the personality, you know, where the media can just script a personality and portray a personality or personage in a way that's pejorative, and just grouping together clips and you know, sort of patterning the news. And the extreme of that is, of course, is what's happening now, is where you just either ignore the news completely or just openly lie to the audience, which was very common in the Third Reich. It's a lot of the techniques are not novel techniques. In fact, the similarities of, when you look at the brown shirts and then the old aristocracy trying to unseat the current administration, they made alliances that were considered temporary, where one thought they could outsmart the other. So a lot of that is going on. So we have all of a sudden we have a triangulation in the American political landscape, and that would be the Republican / Trump supporters, who I am, and for this reason, lumping in the same category. But as Don said earlier, we all three of us have differing reasons for being here, and it's not because we're solely self-defined as Republicans. We just happen to think this is the moral choice that's being presented, and that's the side that we're on. So anyway, so then we have the mainstream Democrats, who are really behaving more like the old-time conservatives in many ways, and then the third wing is the not to be confused with an Enneagram wing, is the radicals, who were kind of alienated by the second Bernie Sanders snubbing, which occurred. It's just ironic that 2016 Bernie gets locked out in almost the same way, and almost the same way goes along with it. And this is kind of what we've got. We've all of a sudden got the rise of a third party that's just kind of an anarchistic. It's hard to tell exactly what their end game is, and maybe they can't tell either. Maybe it's just for the thrill of seeing the flames and acting out whatever insecurities or parental issues they bring to the table as human beings. Hard to say. What do you think, Cindy?
Well, I do. You raised the idea of parental issues. I think that a lot of people who dislike Donald Trump do have father issues. I think that, we've long referred to George Washington as the father of our country, and in an inception way, to some extent that's true. But in a provider way and a protector way, I think that we find ourselves in a position of having Donald Trump be the father of our country, because he is proving himself to be a protector and a provider. And I mean, and he has, his father image is very, very obvious with many children, and in a wide range of ages. They are completely devoted to him. He is completely devoted to them. And I think that probably sticks in the craw of people who do have father issues. And statistically, a lot of people who embrace alternative lifestyles have had poor father figures in their personal lives. And I think there's a wounding there with having to do with fathers that does inspire this really very extreme reaction to Donald Trump. And you can understand maybe mildly disliking someone who's president, but these people actually completely abhor him. And it's not rational. I don't see any rational reason. I wasn't a fan of his when he was on the TV show. I've never followed him closely. I have never been a huge fan of his. But watching him perform as president, I'm very impressed, and I'm very thankful that we have a president like him. So again, this harks back, I think, to a father issue, and the fact that people don't want to accept him as president because the shadow of fatherhood that he casts is so tall. And it really and truly is. I think people just can't handle that. And I do think they're the minority, and I think it may be a drastic minority of people who really fully have Trump derangement syndrome. And when all this stuff comes out about Hunter's laptop and Joe Biden taking money from China, through a couple filters, of course, but when all this comes out and people still insist that they want Trump gone, we see something other than a thought process. We see a reaction that comes out of the gut that is something based on emotion, not thought. And I know you both may want to bring up the concept of feelers tending to be the ones who I have Trump derangement syndrome more than thinkers, but I don't know how to get past this. We can't use reason to say, look, these are the facts. That's not working. So we'll see what happens. But again, fortunately, the people who really are beyond being reached with truth and facts, I believe, is a very small minority.
I want to kind of tag on to what you're saying there, Cindy, that I think I can really put my finger on exactly what it is they're reacting to. And there's a certain mindset, and I'm familiar with this because I kind of came out of a family that was a staunch Democrat, and we viewed that the American government was our government, and we viewed ourselves as the people, and that we were the party of the people, and kind of traces back to FDR, who's the narrative is that he saved the country from the Great Depression and all of that was put into the history books. Well, we believe that government is ours, and we believe that those that have been in government a long time are public servants. And here's an outsider coming in, and he's taking our government away from us, and worst of all, he's a greedy capitalist. Now, if you view government as being something that's of the people, and then you view big business as something that needs to be restrained by government, and that government needs to tax it more so that people have more power, well, then you are going to naturally be antagonistic to someone like Donald Trump, who is not yours. You feel like you have ownership of the government. Never mind whether that's true or not. I don't believe it's true, but I believe that that's the narrative that a lot of people still buy into. And Donald Trump, because he's an outsider, he's a threat to the government is us mindset. I don't know, Ken, if you have anything to add to that. That's where I see a lot of this anti-Trump is coming from, kind of subconscious.
I would say if you take a political argument and reduce it to the like-dislike, then it becomes very similar to how you would react for a musical presentation, or, everybody has their favorite bands and their favorite movies, and you don't have to explain to people why you like or dislike. There's no logic, but there is a rationale for it, and it has to do with values, and values are sort of in the mists of solidity. It's very hard to describe your values. Sometimes you can express them in art and in scripture, or there are different ways of bringing that out. So it's not. It's a little more primordial part of the human psyche. The more advanced part, you still need both, but the logical part of the brain, frontal cortex, it handles the calculations, and these two things need to work together. And when they become unbalanced, you can have you'll have internal conflict. As Carl Jung had proposed, that's the function of the psyche, is to balance itself. But it does happen. People will act out their internal in the outside world, and this is the mirror image. The battles that we fight many times are battles with ourselves, and you can group together you can actually program a large population to go where you want it to go by harnessing that power. So that's kind of what I think is going on here, and it's happening through the perceptual phase in what I would call news impoverishment. It's where you take a large population, you just don't tell them something. You don't tell the good Germans about the concentration camps. You don't tell them about the death camps. They would form their day-to-day reality based on those things not existing, which is why it was such a shock. I see the same thing. We all see the same thing happening now with many of the things that are coming out. The more salacious aspects of Hunter Biden may be unrelated, but what we're finding is they aren't unrelated. And even worse than that is there's actually, today even, we popped up a story about the spy chief of China having contact with the brother of Joe. And these are very, very, very serious matters. And the vast bulk of people that I come in contact with in Blue State are not aware of them at all. Just like the good Germans who weren't aware of what was happening down the street. And maybe they caught a whiff of something that didn't smell right here and there, but they were able to ignore that or repress that. And the way the herd is going now, it will come out eventually. I don't think they can stop this forever. And this is kind of where we are. We're in the throes of a major drama in our national history. And I would say, just to wrap up that aspect of it, is I'm going back again. I'm looking at the Shutdown DC site, and what I'm trying to do is look for linguistic clues. We've already seen, we reviewed the they call the TIP, the Transition Integrity Project. Well, let's go to the other end. And how is this Shutdown DC relating to the scores of people they're trying to ensnare to be motivated to come, hang out in DC and shut down the city? And I'm going to look at the notice that came out about Lisa Fithian's October 20th. It's titled "Escalating Resistance in Times of Crisis: Mass Rebellion Training." Mass rebellion, right there in print. Cindy will show it when we it'll be on the final version. I'm just looking at it on the computer again, and the first sentence outlines the 4 or 5 pillars of the polemic that they're using, and they use, just a reading here, quote, "We are in an unprecedented time of crisis upon crisis: fascism, COVID, white supremacy, climate collapse." And what we have here are 4 premise argument that every one of them has been challenged pretty significantly. And without saying that they're all phony, I would say they're definitely open for discussion, as they all appear to be value judgments. There's no logic here. The climate, again, the climate may be changing, but we don't know why exactly. If everyone sat down and had a logical discussion, they probably would lower their voices. But with those are trigger words. Basically, they're trying to reduce it to a trigger. And now I'm skipping to the end for a reason. And I noticed this in the when I was kind of looking at this before we went on the air here. There's a sentence that really stood out, and they're basically, I'm quoting again, "Yes, Trump and company must go." Parenthetically, despite the fact that the first election was definitely fine, and the next one probably will be too if it's done properly. "And we are in a transformative time where cultures of care and belonging are emerging, overcoming and offering an alternative." Now you see interjecting the values, the positive values. There's nothing wrong with care and belonging. So in this process of ensnaring protest bodies, they're using their better nature, is kind of harnessing that. But watch how this turns. "And offering alternative to the current dominant culture of supremacy," and then dash, "white." Again, this is a race, white. What is white anyway? I mean, it's a combination of many cultures, actually. "Male," again, reverse sexism. "Wealthy," which would be more Marxism. And this is the one that really got me. "And Christian." So the reason that got me is, what if you substituted in the word Jewish? How does this differ? This is what I mean. This is their Mein Kampf. This is their, the way they would craft propaganda that would completely negate the first part of the sentence with values that really are in essence identical to Nazism. When you single out a religion, so now they're singling out the Christian religion in the same way the Nazis singled out the Jewish religion. It's right there in print.
It's disturbing to see some of the aspects of this organization And one thing that, Don, I think it was you who mentioned that they seem to consider that the government is theirs. And an interesting aspect of that is that Shutdown DC uses ArcGIS maps, and I need to click here and show one on the screen. And this is just a sample. This is from the website arcgis.com/ and there's a string here, but it's the it's work that ArcGIS has done in tandem with Shutdown DC. They've plugged in some statistics, and through doing this, they are able to show. And now this one is about this is enemies of the climate or something like that. This is showing where people live who they consider to be enemies of the climate, people who are, I don't know, polluting, whatever. And I do want to plug in just that I'm very much against pollution. I don't believe that carbon dioxide is a poison. So just to get that out of the way. But point being, this map uses statistics that are generated by government entities like cities, and they take the data that has been paid for by tax dollars. Now that I would agree that should be available to all taxpayers and everyone should be able to benefit from it. But what they do is they plug that data into these maps so that they use these maps to identify vulnerable spots in various cities so that they can attack these vulnerabilities with the idea of bringing them down. And when so that what they're in effect doing, they're using data that has been generated by a city in order to destroy, in some measure, that city, to attack that city. So we have these odd, because these people feel that they own the government, we have these odd tentacles that are tapped into. It's like a parasite that they are sucking off the lifeblood of the society and using the monster that's created with this life force is a monster that has its goal as destroying the very entities, cities, people, society, whatever that they have fed off of. So it's very strange cycle.
I hear you, Cindy, and that really goes back to one of my core foundational beliefs is that whenever a free society does anything and in the way of laws and regulations and whatnot, you need to think about how they can be misused. In other words, we never like to think about enemies within us that would seek to sabotage us, but unfortunately we're learning that lesson the hard way. So the question would be, well, why is this information so available if it is useful to enemies of our republic who are here within us? And the Founding Fathers and many others throughout history have warned us that in a republic, the greatest danger, and a free people with their representative government, the biggest danger is those that are the enemy within. So we're learning about that firsthand. Hopefully Americans are getting educated, and, well, we need to be smart about the future, and I've come to the conclusion that we will always have these people among us who have a different paradigm, that they view capitalism as evil and not something that can work for them. And we have to be smart about how we manage them, not outlawing them. But education, I think, is a real key here. So that's one of my foundational things. I like to want to see our educational system actually begin to recognize some of the foundational beliefs that people like this have and help people think about them so that they can not be at the mercy of false ideas that take so many people captive.
In conclusion, on the net effect of all this appears to be a generational theory that the thought crafters, as I'll just refer to generically, thought would work in about a 30-year time frame, and they've since then slowly built this into the educational infrastructure and have trained an entire generation of riot participants who are now being called into action based upon the polemic. And this again goes back to the first show. Now, it was a racism narrative, and they've introduced, in addition to that, the COVID narrative, and the racism narrative supports the white supremacy narrative. And drawing all those things together, we have where we're going today and where we'll go tomorrow and where we'll go next week and the next months after that, until one or the other side emerges victorious, or in what will probably happen is there'll be a synthesis of the two factors. So it's indeterminate where this actually ends up. But what I'll say is that I do believe that there's a substantial effort being made to harm these people, the people that are being trained to go into the tear gas areas and the basically the Shutdown DC. They have a bicycle corps, and it's extremely well organized, and they've done a very good job keeping internal morale alive by perpetuating these imaginary events. And I compare that to the 60s, and there you had the Vietnam War going on. It was a real physical occurrence. There were bombs falling on North Vietnam, and it was a war. I mean, there it is. It's on television, and there are casualties from that war. That was a point source issue. These are the issues of today, are all psychological problems, and they're all figments of imagination and constructs of imagination. And sometimes that's valid. I mean, there are some sociological theories that do tend to bear fruit, and predictive validity. But this time, it just doesn't look like it's going to survive. I mean, we've seen them move from one to another. Again, we started this whole series with racism, and now that's not as much of an issue as election. The way they count the votes for the election. So all of a sudden we've got a different focus, and it's constant. Usually when things are constantly shifting, you're not dealing with a reality. You're dealing with a political construct and a political strategy. So that's kind of what's going on here. We can't predict what's going to happen, and we can't understand always what we see coming out of the Justice Department. We can only hope that the civilians will be protected from what essentially strikes me as being a foreign attack. And it's every advance, so-called, in the field of warfare presents a paradigm that's not understandable at the time it occurs. For example, the British showing up to fight in well-organized columns wearing red uniforms. We laugh at that now. It's a sad issue, obviously, but shooting from behind trees was just off the map for them. That was not part of their war paradigm. And maybe this thing that we're seeing with the Shutdown DC and the possible involvement of foreign funding, official in the case of the Biden case, or unofficial as in the case of what we call George Soros, who's really more like Santa Claus. There's a whole vast network of people. We had Dangermond there with the map company. It was kind of a funny aside that he may or may not be involved in funding some of the activities, at least for the earthbound activists, the earth activists. Then we have the Black Lives Matter activists, and then we have the Antifa, and they've all got equipment, and they're all eating food when they go to these, riots. And, so the resources, their military resources. Who benefits? Does the U.S. benefit? Net effect, no. So, you could just forensically look at cui bono, and it looks to me like a foreign attack. It's just been, again, this is an innovation in the field of warfare that we can't quite understand yet. And I think that's kind of what's going on. And as soon as that's hopefully, I mean, you know, we're seeing it. I think they do see it. I think there is a plan. Don is a little more well versed on the basis for having that position than I am. I just kind of sit back and can't understand the whole picture yet. I just see the reality of the situation on the street, and it doesn't look particularly good at the moment.
Yeah, Ken, I agree with what you're describing there, and I look at this as you characterized it very well as being we're taught to regard, we're being taught by the media and those things that our attention is being drawn to by the powers that be, the powers that want to be, and to prevent Trump's reelection. We're taught to view these psychological problems as very, very real, and I think that's an extremely weak position. But a lot of people get very emotionally activated by that. And I believe that, yeah, I'll look behind the curtain here a little bit with some of the research that I've done that is more long-term. And I think that is something like this, where you see a very weak front, psychological, being used for justification of some pretty draconian censorship, as being a very strong reason to look behind the curtain. And what do we see? Well, my research indicates, and try this on and see if it fits and do your own research, but that the global banking system has for a long time envisioned moving their headquarters to offshore to China. The Federal Reserve in the United States has had a long run of it, but these central banking systems don't last forever, and we have been, as financial analysts have been warning us for a few decades now, on the last legs of our financial survival. Well, typically the historical pattern has been to have a war, regroup, and then set up a new central banking system center. And it had been slated to do that with lots of things moving to China, including a new hub for central banking. Well, President Trump getting elected has thrown a monkey wrench into that, and my belief is that he has been held in the wings for a long period of time, for such a time as this, and we are about to see whether or not in his second term, President Trump will actually take down the hub of the current central banking system and be key in helping put in something else, all the while presuming, of course, that the world is not going to go along with this, that those international banking powers are going to regroup and will begin to oppose another banking system that would be just serving the interests of the United States instead of serving the interests of the private central bank, Federal Reserve, private ownership. So we are, when I say look behind the curtain, the answer is always, almost always, and in this case I believe it is, follow the money and see what's happening to the banking system. And I believe we're watching a show that is meant to distract us from what's really happening with the banking system. And if certain voices that I'm listening to are right, and you can find them, I'm not, they're not secret voices, but they're increasingly hard to find with censorship, is if this is right, that we are heading into a new financial system, I believe we'll see it shortly after President Trump is reelected. I believe that is going to happen. I do believe that we will be dealing with some riots in the streets, but with President Trump not having to stand again for re-election, he's going to move, I believe, decisively against unrest, and not in the way that he has been. I believe American people will be behind him, but we'll see how that unfolds. We are certainly living in exciting times.
For my parting thought, I would like to ask a rhetorical question. Why do people acquiesce to the mob? And I would like to just touch on the concept of principles versus expedience, and hope that people will maybe examine their principles and maybe do a self-questioning as to if they do want to go along with what appears to be the mob, why would they do that? And I think I want to just put out a plea to anyone who might hear this, who might be considering voting for Biden, and just to say, please consider the evidence that's coming out, the facts that are coming out having to do with Joe Biden, his character, his history, his career. And I'm asking people to do that on the basis of having done that myself. After 9/11, I became aware of the role that the Bushes played, and I myself had to reconsider my position on some things. And I'm not a Trump supporter because he's a Republican. I'm a Trump supporter because he's a man of the people. And the acknowledgement that I have made in my own personal journey that the Bushes were complicit in 9/11 has been very painful, and took me a few months. But again, because I made that transition in my own life, I feel that it's okay for me to ask people to consider what the information is that's coming out about Joe Biden, weigh it objectively, and examine your heart and see if you can still vote for him in good conscience. Thank you for joining us for this episode of Poli-Psych Podcast. We hope that you have enjoyed this episode. If you have, we ask that you please click a little thumbs up for this video. We would very much appreciate if you subscribe to us on YouTube, subscribe to us on BitChute, follow us on Twitter, and if you have a moment, please consider visiting our website. Once again, thanks for joining us, and until next time, take care.